The last thing she remembered was the sound of her own breathing. It was July 1985, and the city of Los Angeles had not slept well in months. Not really. Windows that had been left open for decades were now locked shut in the 90-degree heat. Hardware stores across the San Gabriel Valley, the mom-and-pop locksmith shops on Rosemead Boulevard, the True Value on Garvey Avenue, the big Orchard Supply on Valley, had sold out of deadbolts 3 weekends in a row. The shelves where the Schlag and Kwikset boxes normally sat were bare, with handwritten, out-of-stock signs taped at eye level. People were buying dogs. People were buying guns. People were doing both, and still lying awake at 3 in the morning, listening to the neighborhood settle around them, wondering if every creak of the floorboards was just the house cooling down or something else entirely. The police had a name for what they were hunting. They called him the walk-in killer. The press had started calling him something else, something that would stick, something that would outlast the trial, the conviction, the appeals, the decades on death row. A name that still carries weight 40 years later, the kind of weight that makes people lower their voices when they say it, the kind of name that gets attached to a case and never comes off. But before the name, before the task force and the composite sketches and the national headlines and the satellite trucks parked outside the courthouse, there was just the silence after a screen door swings open in the dark. There was just a neighborhood that didn't know it was already inside the story. To understand how Los Angeles got there, how a city of 3.5 million people spent a summer genuinely afraid to sleep, you have to go back further than the summer of 1985. You have to go back to a border town in Texas, to a family that fractured early, to a young man who arrived in California carrying damage that no city was equipped to absorb. You have to go back to the very beginning, because the beginning is where the shape of what followed was formed. El Paso, Texas, sits at the western tip of the state, pressed hard against the Rio Grande, separated from Ciudad Juarez by a river that's narrow enough in places to wade across in the dry season. It is a working-class city, a border city, a place where in the 1960s the economy ran on the railroad, on the military presence at Fort Bliss, on the steady movement of goods and people across a boundary that was more porous than it appeared on any map. The summers there are brutal, temperatures climbing past 100 degrees by July, the Chihuahuan desert spreading out in every direction, the light flat and white and relentless by midday. Ricardo Leyva Munoz Ramirez was born in El Paso on February 29, 1960. A leap year birthday, which means it comes around once every 4 years, which means that even the calendar treated his existence as something outside the ordinary count of days. He was the youngest of 5 children, born to Mercedes and Julian Ramirez. His father worked for the Santa Fe Railroad for years before taking a position as a police officer across the border in Juarez, a job that required crossing the river every morning and crossing back every evening, a life lived on a threshold. By most accounts, the home was strict in the way that homes under economic pressure and physical stress often become. Discipline was administered physically, the kind of childhood that leaves marks that don't appear on any medical chart, that don't show up in any school record, that only become visible in retrospect when investigators are working backward from catastrophe, trying to locate the origin point. But the relationship that investigators, psychologists, and criminologists would return to again and again, the connection that seemed to bend Richard Ramirez towards something darker than ordinary dysfunction was his relationship with his older cousin, Miguel. Miguel Ramirez was a decorated Vietnam veteran who had served in Southeast Asia and come home fundamentally altered. He was, by any reasonable definition, a deeply disturbed man. He had returned from his tour with photographs. Photographs he claimed depicted women he had raped and murdered during his deployment. He showed these photographs to his young cousin. Richard was 11 years old when he first saw them. 11 years old, sitting in a room in El Paso, being shown images that no child should ever be asked to process, shown them by a man he looked up to, a man who wore his military service like a credential. In 1973, Miguel shot his wife in the face during an argument. He shot her in front of Richard. Richard watched her die. He was 13 years old. He was taken in by his sister Ruth and her husband Roberto after that. And it was in their home, in the years that followed, that he began sleeping in cemeteries. Not as a dare, not as a phase that would pass, as a preference, a chosen environment that seemed to offer him something the living world did not. By the time he dropped out of Jefferson High School in El Paso, he had already been arrested twice for marijuana possession. He was drifting between the homes of relatives and acquaintances, using harder drugs, spending time in places and with people that put distance between him and anything resembling a conventional path. He had become deeply absorbed in satanic imagery, not in any organized religious sense, but in the iconography of inversion, of darkness as identity, of evil as something to be claimed rather than avoided. And sometime around 1977 or 1978, he made his way west, to California, to Los Angeles, to a city that was large enough and distracted enough that a young man with no fixed address and no fixed identity could disappear into it almost completely. He lived in cheap motels along the Skid Row corridor in downtown Los Angeles, the kinds of places that charged by the week, that had payphones in the lobby, and a smell of mildew and cigarette smoke that had been embedded in the walls for decades. He stole cars. He shoplifted food from convenience stores on Figueroa and on Broadway. He became deeply absorbed in heavy metal music, particularly the band AC/DC, whose 1979 album Highway to Hell contained a track called Night Prowler that described a figure moving through sleeping neighborhoods in the dark, entering homes, watching people sleep. The song was written as dark fantasy. The band's members, when the connection to Ramirez was eventually made public, found it horrifying and said so clearly. But Ramirez had made the song his own, in a way that was entirely internal, entirely private, entirely invisible to anyone who might have intervened. He was thin, almost gaunt, with dark hair that he wore long and teeth that had been rotting since childhood. The consequence of a diet built almost entirely on junk food, on candy and fast food, and nothing that a dentist would recognize as nutrition. His breath was reportedly noticeable at close range. His appearance was distinctive enough that people who encountered him remembered him. But Los Angeles is a city that has always been very good at not looking at the people it would rather not see. And in the early 1980s, in the margins of a city that was simultaneously hosting the 1984 Olympics and watching its downtown corridors fill with people who had nowhere else to go, Richard Ramirez was very easy not to see. The first murder attributed to Richard Ramirez, that investigators were eventually able to confirm, happened on June 28, 1984. The victim was Jenny Vinco. She was 79 years old, a retired woman living in her son Jack's apartment on Grafton Avenue in the Glassell Park neighborhood of Los Angeles, a hillside community northeast of downtown, where the streets curve along the contours of the terrain and the houses sit close together on narrow lots. Jack Vinco found his mother the following morning when she didn't answer his knock. The apartment door was unlocked. Inside, he found her in her bedroom. She had been stabbed repeatedly. Her throat had been cut so deeply that she was nearly decapitated. The apartment had been ransacked, drawers pulled open, items scattered. A window screen had been removed from outside, pushed in from the yard. There was no sign of forced entry beyond that single displaced screen. The case was filed. It was investigated by LAPD detectives assigned to the Northeast Division. But in the summer of 1984, there was nothing in the evidence to connect it to anything larger, nothing to suggest it was the opening chapter of something rather than a terrible, isolated incident. It looked like a brutal home invasion, the kind of crime that is devastating to a family and nearly invisible to a city of millions. Jenny Vinco's murder would not be publicly linked to the series that followed for almost a year. That gap, 12 months of silence, 12 months in which the case sat in a filing cabinet while the man responsible continued to move through the city, is part of what made the investigation so difficult and so haunting in retrospect. Because Ramirez did not stop after Jenny Vinco. He simply wasn't caught, and the city didn't know yet what it was living alongside. The attacks that would eventually define the case and give it its name began in earnest in the spring of 1985, and they began with a night that demonstrated, in a single evening, the full range of what investigators were dealing with. On March 17th, a 20-year-old woman named Maria Hernandez was returning to her condominium in the Rosemead area of the San Gabriel Valley, pulling into the parking garage beneath her building at around 11:30 at night, when a man stepped out of the shadows with a gun raised. He fired. The bullet struck her keys. She was holding them up in front of her face, either by instinct or by chance, and deflected. She fell. She played dead on the concrete floor of the garage. He stepped over her body and walked up the interior stairs into the apartment she shared with her roommate, Dale Okazaki. Dale was 34 years old. He shot her in the kitchen. She died there, on the floor, while Maria Hernandez lay still in the garage below and waited. He left the building, he walked to his car, and within the hour, on Alhambra Avenue in nearby Monterey Park, he pulled a woman named Tsai Lian Yu from her vehicle, a yellow Chevrolet she had been attempting to drive away from the curb, and shot her. She died 2 days later at a hospital in the San Gabriel Valley. 3 victims in one night, 2 of them dead. The third, Maria Hernandez, alive because a set of keys happened to be in the right place at the right moment, and the police were not yet certain they were looking for the same person across all 3 incidents. The investigation that formed around these attacks was fragmented in ways that now seem almost impossible to accept, but that made complete operational sense given the structure of law enforcement in Los Angeles County in 1985. Los Angeles County is not one jurisdiction. It is a patchwork of dozens. The city of Los Angeles had its own department, the LAPD, with roughly 7,000 officers and its own chain of command running up to Chief Darrell Gates. The county had the sheriff's department, a separate agency covering the unincorporated areas and contracting with dozens of smaller cities. And then there were the individual municipal departments. Monterey Park PD, Rosemead was covered by the sheriff. Arcadia had its own department. Burbank had its own. Glendale had its own. When attacks happened across these jurisdictional lines, information did not automatically flow. Cases were filed locally. Reports stayed within their originating agency, unless someone specifically reached across the boundary to share them. Patterns were invisible, unless someone was actively looking for them, across lines that had been drawn for administrative convenience, not for investigative efficiency. There was one detective who was looking. His name was Frank Salerno, and he was a homicide investigator with the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, assigned to the Homicide Bureau in Monterey Park. Salerno was not a young man by 1985. He had been working homicides for years, and before the Night Stalker case, he was best known for his work on the Hillside Strangler investigation in the late 1970s, the years-long effort that eventually identified cousins Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Buono as responsible for the murders of 10 women in the Los Angeles area. Salerno knew what a serial case looked like from the inside. He knew how long it took for the shape of something to become visible. He knew the specific patience required to work a case that kept expanding, that kept generating new victims before the first ones were understood. And by April 1985, looking at the cases that had come across his desk, he was beginning to see a shape. Working alongside Salerno from the LAPD side was Detective Gil Carrillo, a younger investigator who had caught several of the cases that fell within city limits. The two men were from different agencies with different cultures, different command structures, different institutional loyalties. They built a working partnership anyway, because the alternative was a killer who kept moving through the gaps between departments and leaving nothing behind that any single agency could act on alone. They began meeting. They began comparing notes, laying case files side by side, looking for the thread that connected them. What they found was a method, a consistency that was almost ritualistic in its repetition, a signature that appeared across scenes, separated by miles and weeks, entry through an unlocked window or an unlocked door, or through a screen that had been quietly removed from the outside with a tool or simply by hand. Victims attacked while they slept, or the moment they woke to find someone in the room. Male victims shot first, often fatally in the opening seconds of the attack, before they could respond, before they could protect anyone. Female victims subjected to assault, to sexual violence, to a particular kind of prolonged terror that the case files described in language that was clinical and still devastating. Satanic symbols left at some scenes, a pentagram drawn in lipstick on a bedroom wall, on a victim's thigh, on a surface that would be found by the first officers through the door. Personal property taken, cash from wallets and purses, jewelry from nightstands and jewelry boxes, anything small and portable and valuable, and footprints. A distinctive shoe impression, the same tread pattern, appearing at multiple scenes across multiple jurisdictions. An Avia athletic shoe, size 11.5. By May 1985, Salerno and Carrillo were operating on the working assumption that they had a single offender moving across the Los Angeles basin. The task force that would eventually grow to include more than 200 officers from multiple agencies was beginning to take shape. But the attacks were not slowing down. They were accelerating, the intervals between them compressing, the geography spreading outward in ways that made the boundaries between jurisdictions feel increasingly irrelevant. On May 14, 1985, William Douai was shot in the head in his home in Monterey Park. He survived long enough to reach the phone and call 911. The call came in at 2 in the morning. The dispatcher heard labored breathing and managed to get an address before the line went quiet. Officers arrived within minutes. William Douai died from his wound shortly after. His wife Lillian was found beaten and sexually assaulted. She survived, and she was able to speak with investigators, though her account of what she had seen in the darkness of her own bedroom was fragmentary and traumatic in ways that made it difficult to build a precise description from. On May 29th, an 83-year-old woman was attacked in her home in Monrovia. She survived, though she was beaten severely enough that investigators initially called for a homicide unit. On May 30th, another elderly woman was attacked in Burbank. She also survived. On June 27th, Patty Higgins had her throat slashed in her Arcadia home and died. On July 2nd, Mary Louise Cannon, 75 years old, was killed in her Arcadia home, the same city, 4 days later, as if the attacker was circling back. On July 5th, Whitney Bennett, 16 years old, a teenager sleeping in her own bedroom in Sierra Madre while her family slept in adjacent rooms, was beaten with a tire iron. She survived, though investigators who arrived at the scene initially called it a homicide because the violence had been so extreme. The tire iron had bent. The force required to bend a tire iron against a person is not something that belongs in a residential neighborhood at 2 in the morning. It is not something that belongs anywhere. The pace of the attacks, the geographic spread, the variation in victim age and background, the mixture of homicides and assaults that survivors somehow walked away from, all of it made the case uniquely resistant to the kind of clear public narrative that would have allowed investigators to communicate the danger more precisely. Every time the task force thought it understood the pattern, something didn't fit. Victims ranged from 16 to 79 years old. The attacks were spread across a 30-mile arc of the Los Angeles basin, from the San Fernando Valley in the north to the San Gabriel Valley in the east. Some victims were Hispanic, some were white, some were Asian American. The attacks happened on weeknights and weekends, in small houses and condominiums and apartments. The only consistent threads were the method of entry, the shoe print, the violence, and the symbols left behind. And then there was the music. At the scene of one attack, investigators found an AC/DC baseball cap left behind, dark, with the band's Lightning Bolt logo. It was bagged and logged as evidence. The connection to Night Prowler was made by investigators and later by journalists, and when it became public, it generated a wave of coverage that the band found deeply distressing. AC/DC issued statements distancing themselves from any association with the crimes. The song, they said, was fiction. It was not an instruction. But Ramirez had taken it as something personal, something that belonged to him, something that confirmed an identity he had been constructing since he was a teenager, sleeping in cemeteries in El Paso. The case broke open publicly in August 1985, and when it broke fast and in multiple directions at once. On August 6th, Christopher and Virginia Peterson were shot in their Northridge home. Both survived. Virginia Peterson's wound was to the head, and her survival was described by the treating physicians as medically remarkable. On August 8th, Elias Abawath was shot and killed in his Diamond Bar home, a community in the eastern San Gabriel Valley, where the houses were newer and the streets were quiet, and the idea that something like this could happen there had not yet formed in anyone's mind. His wife, Sakina, was beaten and sexually assaulted. She survived, and in the hours after the attack, she was able to provide investigators with a description that was more detailed than anything they had gathered before. Not a complete picture, but the most complete picture they had. The Sheriff's Department and the LAPD jointly released a composite sketch. It ran in the Los Angeles Times on the morning of August 10th and on every local television station by the evening news cycle. The face in the sketch was angular, dark-haired, with deep-set eyes, and a quality that even in the flat lines of a composite drawing suggested something unsettled. It was not a perfect likeness. Composite sketches never are, built as they are from the fragmented memories of people who saw a face in the dark for seconds or minutes under conditions of extreme stress. But it was close enough that people who knew Richard Ramirez recognized it. The problem was that the people who recognized it were not yet in contact with the task force. On August 17, 1985, the attacks moved north. A 66-year-old man named Peter Pan was shot and killed in his home in the Lake Merced neighborhood of San Francisco, a quiet residential area in the southwestern corner of the city, near the water, the kind of neighborhood where the fog comes in off the Pacific in the early morning and doesn't burn off until noon. His wife Barbara was shot in the head and survived. A pentagram was drawn on her thigh. A message was written on the bedroom wall in lipstick. The San Francisco Police Department was now involved, and the realization that the attacker had driven 400 miles north, committed a near-identical attack in a different city, and presumably driven back, changed the nature of the investigation in a fundamental way. He was not geographically contained. He could go anywhere. The task force was now coordinating across two major California cities and the jurisdictions between them. Then, on August 24th, an orange Toyota that had been stolen from the Chinatown neighborhood of Los Angeles was found abandoned in the Rampart area, a few miles west of downtown. The car had been wiped down, but not with the thoroughness that would have made the effort complete. On the rearview mirror, in a position that suggested the driver had adjusted it after entering the vehicle, investigators found a partial fingerprint. A single partial print lifted from the glass with the standard technique, photographed, preserved. They ran it through California's newly implemented computerized fingerprint identification system, a system called CAL-ID that had only been operational for a short time, and that represented a significant technological advance over the manual comparison process it replaced. The system returned a match within hours. Richard Ramirez, 25 years old. Prior arrests in Los Angeles for auto theft and drug possession. A 1984 arrest for vehicle theft that had resulted in a plea and a fine, not incarceration. An address history that traced through cheap motels and the margins of the city. A photograph on file from his prior arrest. A face that, when Salerno and Carrillo looked at the composite sketch and then at the booking photo, aligned in a way that made the comparison almost unnecessary. The photograph was released to every news outlet in California on the morning of August 30th, 1985. It ran on the front page of every major newspaper in the state. It ran at the top of every local television newscast. Within hours, it was one of the most widely distributed images in California media history. Richard Ramirez did not know any of this when he stepped off a Greyhound bus at the Los Angeles terminal on the morning of August 31st. He had been in Phoenix, Arizona. Investigators would later piece together that he had traveled there after the San Francisco attack, had spent time in the city, had apparently been attempting to purchase a firearm. He was returning to Los Angeles for reasons that have never been fully established. He had, by some combination of confidence and carelessness, and whatever it is that causes people who have been moving through the world uncaught to believe they will continue to be uncaught, decided to come back. He walked into a convenience store on Town Avenue in East Los Angeles at approximately 8:30 in the morning. The Spanish-language newspaper La Opinión was on the rack beside the door, folded to display the front page. His face was on the front page. He was looking at a photograph of himself while standing in a store in the neighborhood where he had committed some of the attacks that had generated that photograph. A group of women in the store recognized him. They began shouting in Spanish, calling out his name, calling out what he was. Ramirez ran. He pushed through the door and onto the street and ran east. He tried to carjack a vehicle on Hubbard Street, grabbed the door handle, tried to pull the driver out. The driver, a man named Faustino Piñon, fought back, grabbing Ramirez's arm through the window, refusing to let him take the car. Ramirez pulled free and ran again. He tried to drag a woman named Angela de la Torre from her car on a nearby street. Her husband, Manuel de la Torre, came out of their house and joined the struggle. The neighborhood was in motion now. Doors were opening. People were coming out of their homes onto the sidewalk. Someone had called the police, but the neighborhood did not wait for the police to arrive. Ramirez was chased on foot through the streets of the Hubbard neighborhood, an area where many residents had been living under the shadow of these attacks for the better part of a year, where people had been locking their windows in the heat and lying awake, listening to their houses settle, where the fear had been specific and sustained and personal. He was caught by a group of residents before a single patrol car arrived. He was beaten. He was held down on the pavement. When officers from the LAPD's Hollenbeck division arrived, they found him on the ground, bloodied, surrounded by the people who had recognized him and refused to let him go. He reportedly said to the officers, and this has been documented in multiple accounts from the scene, save me before they kill me." He was taken into custody. He was transported to the Hollenbeck station. He was identified. He was booked. The task force that had spent months and enormous resources hunting him had not been the ones to catch him. A group of residents in East Los Angeles, armed with nothing except recognition and anger, and the accumulated weight of a summer spent afraid, had done it. The trial of Richard Ramirez was by any measure one of the most complex and procedurally demanding criminal proceedings in California history. It did not begin until January 1989, 3.5 years after his arrest, in August 1985. The delay was the product of extensive pretrial motions, challenges to evidence, questions about jury selection, and the sheer administrative weight of a case involving 13 murder charges, 5 counts of attempted murder, 11 counts of sexual assault, and 14 counts of burglary. The prosecution's evidence was extensive. The fingerprint from the Toyota, the shoe prints from multiple crime scenes, witness identifications, forensic evidence collected from the scenes, and the testimony of survivors who had looked at his face in the darkness of their own bedrooms and lived to describe what they had seen. Ramirez appeared in court with a pentagram drawn on his palm. He shouted, "Hail Satan!" at photographers in the courthouse hallway. He fired his attorneys at various points. He seemed, to many observers who covered the proceedings, to be engaged in a deliberate performance, constructing around himself a mythology of evil that was larger and more permanent than the facts of the case, as if the trial were an opportunity for self-creation rather than accountability, and in a way that was deeply uncomfortable for anyone who thought about it carefully. It attracted an audience. He received fan mail by the boxload. Women wrote to him. One woman, Doreen Leoy, a magazine editor from the San Fernando Valley, had begun corresponding with him shortly after his arrest and had visited him at San Quentin more than 70 times before they married in a ceremony at the prison in October 1996. The marriage endured for years before it effectively ended, by most accounts, sometime after 2009, when DNA evidence definitively linked Ramirez to the 1984 murder of 9-year-old Mei Lung in San Francisco, a killing that predated the recognized series and that added another layer to the already extensive record of what he had done. The jury in the main trial deliberated for 22 days. On September 20th, 1989, they returned verdicts of guilty on all 13 murder counts and on all associated charges. The penalty phase followed, and on November 7th, 1989, the jury recommended the death penalty on 19 of the charges. The judge sentenced Richard Ramirez to death in the gas chamber. Ramirez responded from the defense table with a statement that has been reproduced many times in the decades since, and that captures something essential about the performance he had been sustaining throughout the proceedings. Big deal. Death always went with the territory. He was transferred to death row at San Quentin State Prison, on a peninsula north of San Francisco, where the bay meets the hills, where the fog comes in off the water, and the buildings are old, and the distance between the condemned and the outside world is measured in more than just miles. He filed appeals. The California death penalty appeals process is among the longest and most complex in the country. It is not unusual for cases to spend decades in the system, without resolution, without execution, without any final answer to the sentence the jury recommended. Ramirez's case moved through that process at the pace the system dictated. His health began to deteriorate in his 50s. He had been diagnosed with B-cell lymphoma, a cancer of the lymphatic system. He declined treatment at various points, and by 2013, the disease had progressed beyond what intervention could address. Richard Ramirez died on June 7, 2013, at Marin General Hospital in Greenbrae, California, a hospital just a few miles from the prison where he had spent more than 27 years. He was 53 years old. He died before the state of California ever carried out the sentence that the jury had recommended in November 1989. Frank Salerno retired from the sheriff's department after a career that had included two of the most significant serial homicide investigations in California history. He passed away in 2016. Gil Carrillo retired and went on to consult on true crime productions, speaking publicly about the investigation in interviews and documentaries over the years. The neighborhoods where the attacks had occurred, Glassell Park, Rosemead, Monterey Park, Arcadia, Sierra Madre, Diamond Bar, Northridge, had changed as neighborhoods do over 40 years, absorbing the history into the geography without entirely erasing it. The houses were still there. The streets were still there. The screens on the windows had been replaced many times over. The 13 people who were murdered, Jenny Vinkow, Dale Okazaki, Tsai Lien Yu, Vincent and Maxine Zazara, William Doy, Mabel Bell, Mary Louise Cannon, Patty Higgins, Joyce Lucille Nelson, Layla Knighting, Chainarong Kovananth, Peter Pan. Each had a life that extended in every direction from the moment it was ended. Families, children, and grandchildren. Decades of ordinary mornings that stopped in a specific room on a specific night because a screen had been left unlocked or a window had been left open against the summer heat, or because the particular geography of a life had placed a particular person in a particular house, in a particular part of a very large city, at the wrong moment. That is the detail that stays with you, if you let it, not the mythology that Ramirez spent years trying to build around himself in courtrooms and prison visiting rooms and fan letters, not the pentagram on his palm, or the shouted declarations, or the women who wrote to him, as though evil were a quality to be admired rather than a fact to be reckoned with. The open windows, the 90-degree nights in the San Gabriel Valley, the hardware store shelves bare of deadbolts, the city lying awake in the dark, listening, not yet knowing what it was listening for. The case is closed. The man is dead. The record remains. 13 murder counts, a jury's unanimous verdict, a sentence the state never carried out, a fingerprint on a rearview mirror that broke open a year of silence. A city that learned, in the hardest possible way, that the distance between ordinary safety and catastrophe is sometimes no wider than a window screen left unlatched on a hot summer night. If this case stayed with you, the geography of it, the way it moved through a city and across jurisdictions before anyone could see the full shape of what was happening. There is another case on this channel that follows a similar pattern. A different decade, a different part of the country, the same terrible question at the center. How long can something be happening before anyone realizes the pieces are connected? That one is waiting for you next.